maybe I'm not the only one who doesn't really know the scope of what the National Archives and Records Administration does. What can you tell us to give us some sense of this? It's so cool.
It is. It is very cool. You may have visited us in Washington, D.C., the building that I work primarily out of, which is between Pennsylvania Avenue and Constitution Avenue, right off the National Mall. And of course, we house the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So we have millions of people that come through in any given year to view those documents and view other records that we have on display in that historic building. But I would say that's terrific, and we welcome as many people that want to come to see those documents and to see what we have in Washington, D.C., to please come into that beautiful building. But it's really just the tip of the iceberg. We have 13.5 billion records that are paper records or analog records, physical records in our possession. And they're not just in Washington, D.C. We have them in 40 different locations all across the United States. So we have archival locations across the United States, federal record centers where we store records for other federal agencies. And then, of course, we have presidential libraries and museums all across the United States from Herbert Hoover forward. So it's an incredibly diverse system. It's, geographically heterogeneous. We're in cities, we're in more rural areas, we're in suburbs, we're everywhere in between, all across the United States. And we are responsible, really, we are the nation's record keeper. We are responsible for really two types of records: federal records, which are records that are produced by federal agencies and in decision making going on in federal agencies, the establishment of policies, keeping track of what's going on in federal agencies that's important. Every federal agency, from the Department of Defense to the smallest federal agency, we are responsible for their records. And then, of course, presidential records that are created in the execution of the office of the presidency, which we are also in possession of.
Oh, you will constantly receive a new record. Um, what can you tell us about the role of curation, about who makes decisions, about possibilities to constrain?
So, of those two types of records, every record that is produced in the execution of the office of the presidency, as defined by the Presidential Records Act of 1978, every one of those records is a presidential record that will be maintained by the National Archives for perpetuity. So 100% of those records come to the National Archives. For federal agencies, it's between 1 and 3% of all the records that are produced at a federal agency, roughly, but between 1 and 3%. And how we decide is we have a whole team at the National Archives that works with our Federal Records Division, and they work with the agencies to establish what we call record schedules. And record schedules determine which records will be held permanently by the National Archives and what records will be held temporarily. So we have temporary records that are held at our federal record centers that might be held for 5 years, 10 years. For example, all of your tax returns, they are held for 6 years. So they are temporary records. Every tax return in the United States is held as a temporary record for 6 years. Unless you're in dispute with the IRS, then they're held longer. But after 6 years, they are sent for destruction, and they are destroyed. But then all the new set of tax returns come in and are held, and so that's a continual revolving door of a temporary federal record. But then there are other records, like I said, that document decision making in an agency. So, for example, for the National Archives, my records are permanent records because I am, engaging in decision making along with my senior leadership team every day. So, all of my emails, all of my memos, all of my chat messages that are on my computer that I use throughout the course of a day. Those are all permanent records that will be retained. And so those decisions are made through record schedules, through our team in consultation with federal agencies, and eventually those federal record schedules make their way up to me. And I review them and then I approve them. And once I approve them, they're implemented.
So listening to you talk about this makes me wonder about the difference between the the most significant things that are in the National Archives and the really tiny, the mundane, right? I'm no offense, but I imagine your emails are not all super significant. Some of them might just be right. So, so what's the reasoning behind the permanency? I imagine it has to do with security, safety, but honestly, as I listen to you, I think, wow, everything, every piece of your work.
Yes, yes. So, I mean, a lot of things, well, I mean, for me, things that cross my desk, I don't engage in any personal like aspect in on my federal email, except, very few people have my federal email that I use. Now, every once in a while, there'll be a personal email that'll get in there because my husband will forget and he'll email me there instead of at my Gmail or something like that. And it'll be something like, what are we having for dinner today? Or I don't know, or, something like that. And then I do file that under a non-record personal email. I have a very sophisticated filing system for my email. So everything else, though, I mean, is, subject matters that we're dealing with at the National Archives. So once I'm done with that email, it goes into a particular file, a folder within my email system. So someday someone would have access to all of my emails and they would be able to look in my file folders that are recreated. And if they wanted to know all the work that I did with presidential libraries, they would all be in my presidential libraries file folder. But some things, yeah, some things are smaller, or decisions that come up. Anything that is for my approval that has my signature on it certainly is a permanent federal record because that documents a decision that we made at the National Archives, and that will be preserved so that people can look and understand why we made that decision, what was the rationale behind it, and when did I approve it, and what was the backstory on it, basically, what were the arguments that went into that particular decision.
So the other piece of scope, at least one other piece, of probably 20 pieces of scope. But the second piece of scope that's really curious to me that I'd love to hear more about is what is it like to run an organization of that size? 2,600 employees,
Yeah, we
2,700?
fluctuate between 26 and 2,800 at any given time, based on hiring and things like that. I mean, that is, I came from, it's about the same size as the Library of Congress, a little bit bigger. They're in I think the 3,000s. And so we're just a little bit smaller than that. The challenge is really the fact that we are all across the United States. So I made it a priority when I became the archivist that, I of course wanted to meet staff in Washington, D.C., and then we have a very big facility right near Washington, D.C. in College Park, Maryland, where is actually our largest facility, where we have more people employed in College Park in that location than any other facility across the United States. But I made it a priority that I needed to meet people away from Washington, D.C. I mean, half of the agency is employed other places other than Washington, D.C. So I really had to hit the road so I could go and visit these various facilities, presidential libraries, archival facilities. And one of the most important things when I go to those facilities, yes, I want to see the facility and I love to see the records that are housed there. But the most important thing I can do is what we do in the morning, which is I sit down and I meet with staff, all the staff that are employed at that facility, whether it's a small team of 20 or 25 people up to our National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis that has hundreds of people that work in our veterans records and our civilian records, civilian federal service records. And yeah, I mean, it's a very diverse workforce. We have people, that work in all different areas, that work in office administration, archivist techs, all the way up to senior archivists. We have people that work in communications, we have people working in congressional relations and affairs. So there's a lot of different job series, a lot of different types of people that we employ. I think it's helpful to me that I served as a federal employee prior to coming to be the head of a federal agency. I mean, yeah, I was employed at the Library of Congress and, I worked in the bureaucracy in various roles, always in management roles, but I worked in the federal bureaucracy. So I understood how that operates and I understood what it's like to work as a staff member. So, I think I have a slightly different approach to how I interact with staff than maybe someone who has not come up through, I came up through a different system, through a different agency, but I still remember what that's like and what it's like to be a federal employee.